The war was finally over. After years of bloodshed, the Galactic Alliance, led by human forces, had claimed victory over the once powerful Zerithian Empire. The stars no longer echoed with the roars of battle, but the silence left behind felt heavy. For many, the cost of victory was too great to celebrate. Inside the ruined Zerithian palace, Princess Elira sat on a cracked throne. Her once beautiful robes were torn, her silver hair tangled and dull. She stared at the towering doors of the throne room, waiting for her conqueror to enter. Her people were scattered, her soldiers defeated. All she could do now was face her fate with dignity. The sound of boots echoed through the hall. Human soldiers marched in, their weapons at the ready, but their faces showed no joy. They were tired, their eyes hollow from the horrors they had seen. At the front of the group was their leader, a tall man with sharp features and a commanding presence. He wore a battle-worn uniform, his dark eyes scanning the room like he could see every secret hidden within its shadows. The princess straightened her back, refusing to show fear. "So, you are the human who has taken everything from us," she said, her voice cold but steady. The man stopped a few steps away from her throne and looked at her. "I am Captain Marcus Kane," he said simply. His voice was deep and calm, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much. "I am here to discuss terms. Your people will not suffer if you cooperate." Elira's silver eyes narrowed. "Your kind has already made my people suffer. What more could you take from us?" Marcus didn't flinch at her words. Instead, he studied her, as if trying to understand her anger. "This war was not my choice, Princess," he replied. "But now that it's over, I want to ensure peace. There's been enough death." His words surprised her. She had expected arrogance or cruelty from the man who had led the charge against her empire. But there was something different about him, something familiar. For a moment, she thought she recognized the way he spoke, the way he carried himself. But that was impossible. She shook the thought away. "Peace," she said bitterly. "How can there be peace when you stand in the ruins of my home?" Marcus sighed and took a step closer. "Peace begins here, Princess, with us." The weight of his gaze made Elira uneasy, but she held her ground. She didn't know why, but something about him felt strange, like a half-forgotten dream lingering just out of reach. As Marcus turned to issue orders to his men, Elira stared at him, her heart uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that she knew him from somewhere. But how could that be? The seeds of a long-buried connection had been planted, though neither of them knew just how deep their shared past would run. Princess Elira refused to let the human conqueror see her fear. Though her empire lay in ruins, she would not bow. As Captain Marcus Kane stood in her broken throne room, issuing orders to his soldiers, she observed him carefully. His presence filled the space, commanding attention and respect. But there was something else, something that nagged at her memory like a shadow she couldn't grasp. "You speak of peace," Elira said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence. "Yet your soldiers march through my palace, weapons drawn, as if I am some trophy of war." Marcus turned to her, his expression calm but firm. "I have no interest in trophies, Princess," he replied. "My only goal is to end the bloodshed. If you work with us, I can ensure your people are treated fairly." Her silver eyes flashed with defiance. "You expect me to trust the very man who led the attack that destroyed my people?" Marcus stepped closer, his boots echoing against the cracked marble floor. "Trust isn't given freely, I know," he said evenly. "But this war is over. Continuing to fight, even with words, will only bring more pain." Elira stood, her posture regal despite the torn state of her dress. "Pain is all I have left, Captain Kane. Your victory has ensured that." For a moment, Marcus's gaze softened, and he hesitated before responding. "You've lost much, so have I. But if we continue to let this war define us, we'll lose even more." Elira narrowed her eyes, studying him. His tone carried no arrogance, no mockery. It was strange. She had always imagined the human commander as a ruthless, unfeeling brute. Yet here he stood, speaking to her not as an enemy, but as someone who seemed to understand loss. "I will not make this easy for you," she said coldly. "I wouldn't expect you to," Marcus replied. The tension between them was interrupted when one of Marcus's soldiers approached. "Captain, we've secured the lower levels. No resistance remaining," the soldier reported. Marcus nodded and dismissed him before turning back to Elira. "You'll be escorted to safer quarters while we stabilize the area," he said. Elira's chin tilted upward. "I'll stay here. This is my palace, no matter how broken it may be." Marcus sighed, but didn't argue. "Very well. But know this, Princess, I didn't come here to humiliate you. My mission is to rebuild, not destroy what remains." As Marcus left the throne room, Elira sank back onto her throne, her thoughts swirling. She hated that his words made sense, and she hated even more that something about him seemed so familiar. She glanced at the shattered remains of a golden mirror near her throne and caught a glimpse of herself, disheveled, tired, but still standing. She had lost everything, but she would not lose her pride. The dim light of the ruined palace filtered through the cracked windows as Princess Elira sat alone on her throne. The sound of the human soldiers moving through the halls echoed faintly in the distance, but her focus was elsewhere. Her mind replayed every word, every gesture from Captain Marcus Kane. Something about him unsettled her. His voice, his movements, they weren't what she expected from a man who had led the charge against her empire. There was a strange familiarity in the way he spoke, as though she had heard it before in another life. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts drift back to a time before the war, before the destruction. Elira was just a child then, living on the peaceful colony of Veneris IV, where humans and Zerethians once coexisted. She remembered the laughter of children, the warm golden fields, and a boy. Elira's brow furrowed as she tried to recall the boy's face. He was human, with dark hair and a bright, confident smile. His name was Markin. Yes, Markin. He had been her closest friend, her companion on countless adventures. They had spent days building forts from scraps of metal and dreaming of a future where their two species lived in harmony. But that dream was shattered when the colony was attacked. She had been taken back to her empire, and the humans were driven away. For years, she thought Markin had been lost, just another casualty of a universe that thrived on conflict. Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. Could it be? Could Captain Marcus Kane and Markin be the same person? No, she whispered to herself, shaking her head. It was impossible. Markin had been a boy, full of life and mischief. Marcus Kane was a soldier hardened by war, a conqueror who had led the charge against her people. Still, the doubt lingered in her mind. She thought about the way he spoke of peace, the way he carried himself with a sense of responsibility rather than arrogance. It reminded her of the promises Markin had made to her as a child, promises to always protect her, no matter what. A sudden knock at the door broke her thoughts. One of Marcus's soldiers entered, bowing slightly. "Princess Elira, Captain Kane requests your presence in the main hall," he said. She stood, smoothing her tattered dress and straightening her posture. "Tell your captain I will meet him shortly," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. As the soldier left, Elira placed a hand on her chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. If Marcus truly was Markin, she needed to know. But how could she ask without revealing too much? She made her way toward the hall, her mind racing. If there was even a chance that the boy from her childhood had become the man who now stood before her, then her world was about to become far more complicated than she ever imagined. The grand hall of the palace felt colder now, as if the walls themselves mourned the loss of everything they once stood for. Elira walked with measured steps, each footfall echoing in the empty space, her thoughts still heavy with doubt and curiosity. She had sent word to Captain Marcus Kane that she would meet him shortly, but her mind was already racing with the possibility that the human commander before her could be the very boy from her childhood, the one who had promised to protect her no matter the cost. She reached the main hall and paused just outside, taking a deep breath. Inside, Marcus stood near a large table covered with holographic maps of the war-torn regions. He was deeply focused, marking areas for reconstruction, yet his posture was weary. The war had drained everyone, but there was something about his presence that still commanded authority. "Princess Aelira," Marcus said, not looking up at her immediately, his voice steady but low. "Captain," Aelira replied, her voice betraying a hint of hesitation. She had to know if the man before her truly was Markin, the boy she once knew. But how could she ask him directly? How could she bring up a past that seemed so far away, so impossible now? Marcus finally turned to face her, and the moment their eyes met, Aelira felt a jolt in her chest. His dark eyes seemed familiar, too familiar. The same eyes that had once laughed with her in the meadows of Veneris IV. Her heart skipped a beat. "I've been reviewing the reconstruction plans for your people," Marcus said, gesturing toward the map. "But we need your guidance to make sure we don't overlook anything important." Aelira nodded but didn't move closer. "I've seen your soldiers work. They're thorough." She paused, trying to steady herself. "I didn't realize you were such a strategist, Captain." Marcus smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The war forced me to become one. But you don't care about that, do you?" Her heart clenched. No, it wasn't about war. It was about Markin. The boy who had once promised to keep her safe when the stars still shone brightly in their peaceful world. The boy she had never forgotten, even as she grew into the woman now standing before him. "Tell me, Captain," Aelira began slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "were you born on Veneris IV?" Marcus paused at the question, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing over his features. His eyes softened, and for the briefest moment, Aelira saw the boy she remembered. The one who had always been so full of life, so full of hope. But that hope had been shattered along with their world. "I was," Marcus finally answered, his voice quieter now. "I was born on Veneris IV, many years ago, before everything changed." Aelira took a step closer, her breath catching. It was him, her childhood friend, the boy who had been taken from her when the war began. He had become a soldier, a man hardened by battle, and she had become a princess burdened by her kingdom's fall. "I knew a boy on Veneris IV," she said softly, the words almost a confession. "His name was Markin. He swore to protect me." Marcus's expression changed, a flicker of something, regret, sorrow, flashing in his eyes. "Markin." He repeated the name like a forgotten echo. Aelira reached out, a trembling hand touching the edge of the table between them. "It's you, isn't it? You're him, Markin." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of recognition hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Aelira's childhood friend, the boy who had once made her feel safe, was now the very man who had led the war that destroyed her people. But even in this truth, something else stirred between them, something deeper than the battlefields, deeper than their pasts, a shared history, and a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild more than just the war-torn lands of their worlds. Marcus took a slow breath, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Princess, it's me. I'm Markin." The room seemed to grow smaller as the truth settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Aelira's heart pounded in her chest, each beat reminding her that the boy she had once known, the boy who had been her closest friend, was now the very man who had led the war against her people. Markin, stood before her, a man shaped by battle, a soldier who had sworn an oath to defend his people, yet one who had never forgotten his childhood promise to her. Aelira struggled to process the flood of emotions that rushed through her. Memories of their time together on Veneris IV seemed to come alive again. The laughter they shared, the long hours spent running through the fields, the way Markin had always made her feel safe. Those days felt like a distant dream now, one she could never return to. "How could you?" Aelira whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You were my friend, Markin. How could you fight against me? How could you become the very thing that destroyed my people?" Marcus, or Markin, seemed to flinch at her words, his face hardening for just a moment before softening again. He stepped closer to her, his gaze steady but filled with regret. "I didn't choose this, Elira. I didn't choose this war. It was thrust upon me, just like it was thrust upon you." Elira shook her head, her hands clenched at her sides. "You didn't have to become this. You could have stopped it. You could have found me, protected me. You promised me, Markin. You promised that no matter what happened, you would always protect me." The air between them grew thick with the weight of her words. Elira could feel the tears threatening to spill, but she held them back. She wouldn't allow herself to break down in front of him, not after everything that had happened, not after all the pain her people had endured because of the war. Markin stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never forgot that promise. Not for a second. But when Veneris IV was destroyed, when I lost everyone, including you, I had nothing left. I thought you were dead. I thought I had failed you." Elira's breath caught in her throat, the realization hitting her hard. "He didn't abandon me. He thought I was gone." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt like an ocean between them, each lost in their own thoughts. Elira wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make him understand the pain she had felt. But the truth was, she had felt that pain too. She had lost everything, just as he had. "Markin," Elira said softly, the name slipping from her lips like a prayer. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to be your enemy. I never wanted us to be like this." Markin reached out, his hand hovering between them, unsure whether to touch her or not. "I don't want to be your enemy either, Elira. I never did. But I didn't know what else to do. I thought if I fought, I could protect what was left of humanity. I thought it was the only way to make up for all the people I lost." Tears filled Elira's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she took a step toward him, her voice breaking with emotion. "We're both lost, Markin. But maybe we can find a way back. Together." Markin's eyes softened, and for the first time since they had reunited, there was a flicker of hope in his gaze. "Together," he repeated, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and longing. And in that moment, despite the pain, despite the years lost, Elira realized that the bond they once shared had not been entirely broken. It had been buried beneath the weight of war, but it was still there, waiting to be rebuilt. The days following Elira's confrontation with Marcus felt like they were moving in slow motion. The palace, once a place of power and luxury, now felt empty and cold. The walls seemed to echo with the ghosts of the past, of a time when peace had been possible, when dreams of unity between humans and aliens weren't just wishes but promises. Elira spent her hours in the quiet chambers of the palace, her mind restless, filled with conflicting thoughts. It was impossible to ignore what Marcus had said. He had truly believed she was dead. The boy who had promised to protect her had lost everything, just as she had. But knowing this didn't erase the years of pain, the destruction of her people, and the countless lives lost because of a war neither of them had wanted. Could they really rebuild their trust after all of this? Could they look past the wounds of the past and find a way forward? Marcus, too, seemed to struggle with the weight of their shared history. He had been part of the force that crushed her empire, and no amount of explanations could take that away. Yet he had stayed by her side since their reunion, offering help and support, never once pushing her to forgive him. Every word he spoke now seemed carefully chosen, as if he feared crossing the line between offering assistance and imposing himself where he wasn't wanted. They met in the palace garden one evening. The sky above was dimming with the soft hues of sunset, casting long shadows on the overgrown path. Marcus stood by a crumbling stone bench, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for her. Elira approached slowly, her steps deliberate. She had come to this place, not to talk about the past, but to try and understand how they could move forward. The world they had known was gone, and if there was any chance of building something new, it would require both of them working together. "You came," Marcus said, his voice soft, but with an edge of surprise, as if he hadn't truly believed she would come to him. "I had to," Alara replied, standing just a few paces away from him. She glanced at the shattered remnants of the garden, the flowers long since wilted from neglect. It was a reflection of everything around them, ruined, but not entirely lost. "There is so much to rebuild." Marcus nodded, his eyes steady on her. "I know, but we can't rebuild the past, Alara. We can't undo the destruction." "I don't expect us to," she said, "but we can try to rebuild what's left. We can start again, if you're willing to help." There was a long pause as Marcus seemed to contemplate her words. The silence was thick, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of earlier days. It was different now, full of understanding, of an unspoken agreement. "I want to help," Marcus said finally, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "But trust takes time." "I know that." Alara felt a flicker of hope rise in her chest. Trust. It was a fragile thing, like glass, shattered by the weight of war and years of separation. But it could be mended. She had seen it before. In small moments when people came together despite their differences. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. "We'll have to rebuild it together," Alara said, her voice firmer now. "It will take time, but we can do it." Marcus took a step closer to her, his eyes searching hers. "I won't ask you to forgive me all at once, but I'll prove to you that I'm not the enemy you think I am." Alara nodded. "Then let's start. Together." And for the first time since their world had crumbled, they stood side by side, looking out at the broken garden. It was a beginning. A small one, but a beginning nonetheless. There was a long road ahead of them, but they were ready to walk it together. Alara stood at the balcony of the palace, staring out at the barren horizon. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The remnants of war were everywhere. Cratered fields, ruined cities, and broken people. The path to peace was long, and though she had begun to trust Marcus, doubts still lingered in her heart. Could they really rebuild everything that had been lost? Could they heal the wounds of a shattered empire? But as the days passed, Alara began to see small changes. The humans had started to clear the rubble, rebuilding what could be saved. Marcus was proving himself. His actions spoke louder than his words. He worked tirelessly to ensure that her people weren't oppressed, treating them with dignity and respect. Slowly, Alara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for a future beyond war. That hope, however, was shattered one cold evening when chaos erupted in the palace. It was late when Marcus arrived at her chambers, his face grim. "Princess, there's trouble. A faction of your people, the Zerithian resistance, has plans to sabotage the peace process. They don't want to see a treaty with humans. They believe the old ways, the wars, are the only path to restoring Zerithian glory." Alara's heart sank. The resistance had been a thorn in her side long before the war, but to hear that they were still active in such a critical time made her blood run cold. "What do they plan to do?" "We don't know yet," Marcus replied, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed the urgency. "But there's a strong chance they'll strike tonight, trying to destabilize our efforts. It could be an assassination or a direct attack." Alara turned to face him, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had to act, and she had to act fast. "We need to stop them. We can't let them ruin everything we've worked for." Marcus nodded. "I agree, but we need to be careful. If we move too quickly, we could fall into their trap." Just as Alara was about to speak, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. One of Marcus's soldiers burst into the room, breathless. "Captain, Princess, the resistance has taken control of the North Wing. They've barricaded themselves inside and have hostages." Alara's heart raced. Hostages. That meant innocent lives were at risk. People who had nothing to do with the Resistance's war against peace. We need to move now. I can't let more of my people die. Marcus turned to her. You can't go. It's too dangerous. I'm not asking for permission, Marcus, Alira replied, her voice firm. These people are my responsibility. I won't let anyone suffer because of a group that can't see reason. Marcus hesitated, but the look in her eyes told him there was no changing her mind. He sighed, knowing she was right. Then I'll go with you. We'll take care of it together. Alira nodded, and they quickly gathered a small team of trusted soldiers. As they moved through the palace, the tension was thick. Every corner, every shadow, felt like a potential danger. But Alira was resolute. She couldn't stand by while her people were threatened, not again. They reached the north wing, where the resistance was holed up. The corridor was eerily quiet, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Alira's breath was steady, but her mind raced. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. Marcus signaled for the team to take positions. We moved carefully. No sudden moves. Alira was ready. She had faced many dangers in her life, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for peace, and she would do anything to protect the fragile hope they had built together. With a final nod, Marcus motioned for them to advance. The resistance wouldn't win this time. The corridor was dark, the only light coming from flickering torches along the stone walls. Alira's steps were quiet, but her heart was pounding in her chest. The resistance had taken control of the north wing, and every second felt like an eternity. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, her people's future, her promises to Marcus, and the fragile peace they were working to build all rested on this moment. She glanced over at Marcus, who was moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced countless battles, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tightness in his shoulders. The man who had been her childhood friend had changed so much since their reunion. War had shaped him into someone strong, but also someone who carried the scars of battle. She hoped, for both their sakes, that they could end this without more bloodshed. They reached the door of the north wing. Alira could hear voices on the other side. Angry, shouting voices. The resistance was organizing, preparing to strike. But Alira had come here to stop them before they could make their move. There was too much at stake. Remember, our goal is to protect the hostages, not escalate the violence, Marcus said in a low voice. His eyes met hers, steady and determined. We'll go in together. You're in charge of negotiating, Princess. Alira nodded, her grip tightening around the hilt of her dagger. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, but she had no choice. Her people were counting on her. The world was counting on them both. Marcus motioned to the soldiers behind them. On 3, 1, 2. He kicked open the door. The resistance fighters were caught off guard by the sudden intrusion. They scrambled, reaching for weapons, but Marcus and his team were faster. Shots were fired, but they weren't aimed to kill. Alira's soldiers were trained to disable, not destroy. They couldn't afford to risk more lives. Alira stepped into the room, her voice calm but commanding. Enough, she shouted, her words cutting through the chaos. You have no reason to fight. This war is over. You are only hurting your own people. The room fell silent. The resistance fighters froze, their eyes shifting between Alira and Marcus. They were confused, unsure what to make of the situation. Alira could see the fear in their eyes, the desperation of those who had fought for a cause they no longer understood. They were just like her, lost in the aftermath of war. You think I don't know what it's like? Alira continued, her voice softer now, though still strong. I've lost everything, too. My home, my family, my people. But this isn't the way forward. Violence won't bring us peace. It will only destroy us all. One of the resistance fighters, a tall man with dark eyes, stepped forward. He looked at Alira for a long moment, then lowered his weapon. But we've been betrayed, he said hoarsely. By the humans. By you. Elira shook her head. I haven't betrayed you. I'm trying to save us all. The humans didn't start this war. We've both suffered. But if we don't work together, we will both lose. The man stared at her, and for a long moment, the room was silent again. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog. But slowly, one by one, the other resistance fighters began to lower their weapons. The weight of her words had struck a chord with them. They had fought for so long, for a cause that had seemed righteous, but now they were realizing that the war was over, and they were left with nothing but their own destruction. Elira stepped forward, her voice steady. Let's end this. No more fighting. No more loss. We will rebuild together, or we will all fall apart. The room was still. Then the man who had spoken first nodded slowly. We'll stand down, he said, his voice raw. But we'll need your help. All of you. Elira's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had done it. They had stopped the fighting. And with it they had saved the fragile peace that had begun to take root. But this was only the beginning. There was still much to rebuild, many wounds to heal. As the resistance fighters dropped their weapons and began to move toward the door, Elira looked over at Marcus. He nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. They had done it, together. The war was over. The road to peace was still long, but for the first time in a long while, Elira felt hope. Real, tangible hope for the future. Together, they would rebuild, and together, they would create a new beginning for both their people. The tension in the palace was palpable as Elira and Marcus stood side by side, overlooking the scene unfolding before them. The battle had ended, but it wasn't just the fight for the North Wing that worried them now. The resistance had been quieted, and the hostages freed, but Elira knew the true test was still ahead. The test of rebuilding their fractured world. With the threat of violence temporarily silenced, the uneasy calm that followed felt like a fragile glass, ready to shatter at any moment. The question that loomed in Elira's mind was simple. Could they really move forward, or had they waited too long to stop the war from consuming them both? Marcus stood beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon, the same uncertainty written across his face. He had fought hard to end the war, but now he was faced with the challenge of navigating the new delicate peace. We can't afford to wait, Elira said softly, breaking the silence. The longer we hold off on peace talks, the harder it will be to convince everyone that this is the right choice. Marcus nodded slowly, his jaw tense. I know, but after everything that's happened, how do we make them believe we can change things? Elira turned toward him, her eyes determined. We don't ask them to believe it. We show them, every day. She glanced out at the once beautiful fields surrounding the palace, now marred by the remnants of war. For all their efforts, the road to peace was still littered with the ashes of the past. But the key to their future lay in the simple truth that they couldn't undo what had already been done. All they could do now was move forward, step by step, and show everyone that the future could be different. Marcus glanced at her, his expression softening. You're right, he said. We have to lead by example. Just then, the doors to the throne room opened, and a group of high-ranking officials from both the Zerithian and human forces entered. The peace talks were about to begin, and though Elira could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, she steeled herself for what was to come. The next few hours would decide the fate of not only her people but the future of the galaxy. The first to speak was a Zerithian general, his tone harsh and distrustful. You think you can undo the damage done to our people with words. You think a few promises will heal the wounds. Elira took a deep breath, stepping forward to address the room. I don't expect anyone to forgive us overnight. I don't expect to fix everything with a single agreement, but we can choose to move forward, together. If we don't, we'll lose everything we'd fought for. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. It was a turning point. It was her moment to prove that the choice for peace could outweigh the bitterness of the past. But the room was still filled with doubt. How could they trust her? How could they trust any of them? She glanced at Marcus, who stood beside her. He nodded, as if silently telling her to continue. I have seen the cost of this war. I have lost more than any of you could understand. But I also know that continuing this fight is not the answer. If we want to rebuild, we must be willing to change, to trust each other. Not for me, not for Marcus, but for the future. For the children who will inherit this world. There was a long pause before another voice spoke, a human delegate who had been silent until now. I'm willing to try, but I won't pretend it will be easy. The others murmured in agreement, some hesitant, others more determined. Slowly, the room began to shift. The seeds of doubt were still there, but they were starting to give way to something else, something that felt like the beginning of hope. As the discussions began, Aelira stood beside Marcus, knowing that this was just the first of many difficult conversations. But for the first time in a long while, she felt that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild the broken pieces of their world. And maybe, just maybe, peace was possible after all. The room was filled with tension, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a flicker of hope. The peace talks had begun, and despite the uncertainty, the future seemed just a little bit brighter. Aelira stood beside Marcus, her heart racing as the voices of Xerithian and human delegates filled the room. The weight of her people's future rested on these negotiations, and she couldn't afford to make a mistake. The hours passed in a blur of discussions, compromises, and quiet arguments. Aelira had never thought of herself as a diplomat, but the events of the last few weeks had forced her into a new role. Marcus was by her side, guiding her through the process, his calm presence a steadying force. They worked together, combining their knowledge of both worlds, navigating through the complexities of politics, and finding a way to connect where it seemed there was no path. By the time the talks drew to a close, a fragile agreement had been made. There were still many obstacles to overcome, but they had agreed to start rebuilding, together. The resistance, once a powerful force against peace, had been subdued, and the people were beginning to see the possibility of a different future. As the delegates began to leave, Aelira stood at the head of the table, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't over, far from it, but it was a start. They had taken the first step toward healing, and for the first time in a long while, Aelira felt like she wasn't alone. Marcus had proven himself, not just as a soldier, but as someone who was willing to fight for a future that didn't have to be defined by war. Marcus moved beside her, his voice low as he spoke. That went better than I expected. Aelira smiled, though it was a weary smile. We're not finished yet, but it's a step, a small one. He nodded. It's the first step. That's what matters. Aelira looked around the room, where delegates from both sides were now speaking in quieter voices, their expressions a mixture of relief and wariness. They had agreed to work together, but trust wasn't something that could be built overnight. It would take time. The scars of war were deep, and though the talks had gone well, the real challenge was yet to come, healing the wounds of both their people. Marcus met her gaze, his eyes filled with something Aelira couldn't quite place. Hope, maybe. But there was something more. A bond that had grown stronger between them through shared loss, hard decisions, and the understanding that they had both lost too much to turn back now. I'll stay by your side, Marcus said softly, his voice just for her. Whatever comes next, I'll be here. Aelira's heart fluttered. She didn't know if it was the peace they had just secured or the connection that had rekindled between them, but she felt something shift inside her. There was still so much to do, so much rebuilding, so many challenges ahead. But for the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't seem so dark. Maybe, just maybe, peace was within their reach. I'm glad you're here, Aelira replied, her voice steady. We can't do this alone. I never could have imagined it, but now, I think we can rebuild. Together. And as they stood there, looking out over the city that had once been torn apart by war, There was a sense that the road ahead, though long, was one they would walk together. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be many more challenges, but for the first time, Aelira allowed herself to believe that peace was not only possible, it was something they could build. Together, they would create a future. Together, they would heal. And together, they would find a way to make their people's dreams of a united galaxy a reality.